Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Previous just before we did the video on what are the wars that the United States won, and we talked about some wars that the United States won, like the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Mexican American War, the Spanish American War, World War One, World War Two. Now we're headed towards these conflicts that the United States did not win because the United States has an impressive track record when it comes to winning wars, but that doesn't hey Lisa, what's going on? That doesn't equate to a perfect record. The United States is not undefeated when it comes to war. So let's get into some of the ones that the United States lost. This one, the first one is Red Cloud's War. This is one of these series of fightings known as the Indian Wars. See, because the United States, um, like I said, they developed an idea. We said in the previous video, they developed an idea of um, manifest destiny. Basically, this idea of manifest destiny was like the United States believing, and a lot of it had to do with religion, that we were destined because of our values. This still theory just started to develop around the time of the Second Great Awakening, which was like in uh, the middle of the mid 1800s per se, and tied to Protestant Christianity. So the theory started to develop that the United States, that we were like the new Jerusalem, we were like the new Israelites. The Israelites of the Bible, they come out of Exodus and they are told by God to conquer all the land, conquer, the seven different tribal nations that existed, in the Levant, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites. The Israelites were told, the commandment by God, to win this war. So because Protestant Christianity, which is the main branch of Christianity followed here in the United States, is solo scriptura, means they don't follow any traditions like the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition. They just follow the Bible. So, starting with the Pilgrims, we always identified ourselves as the new Israel, the city, the shining city upon the hill. So, with that religious fervor came this idea that we have the best form of government. We have republicanism, we have democracy, and we have the Christian religion and the English language. So basically, we are superior to other groups. So just like the Israelites were allowed to conquer and subjugate the ancient tribes of the Near East, we now, the new Israelites, the Americans, have the right to do so in the Americas. We are going to extend our reach from the Atlantic Ocean, where we were founded, to the Pacific Ocean, right? Problem is, there are indigenous people throughout this entire land, right? And two of those indigenous groups were the Arapaho and uh, Cheyenne, as well as the Lakota, Indians. When we think of Indians in the United States, in our imagination, what occurs to us is the Sioux Nation, the Lakota Nation, right? That was their attire, the feathered headdress, and the yeah, that was their culture, and the teepees was their culture, because those are the ones we had the most issues with. Now, for a bit of background, um, they had they were kind of conquerors themselves. They had gone to war in the early 1820s with the Crow Nation, another Indian nation, and they won this battle with the Crows, right? Because um, they were great horsemen, right? Because It's interesting, and this I'll mention as an aside about the horse. The animal of the horse um, existed in America before the Ice Age, but it went extinct by the time Native Americans come over from the Bering Straits. 10,000 years ago, from the Bering Straits to the Americas, because Native Americans trace their ancestry back to Siberia, Eastern Russia. And in the Ice Age, there was a land bridge on the Bering Straits between Russia and Alaska, and that's how the Native Americans got here. So by the time they got here, there were no horses here. The horse had gone extinct in the American continent. But of course, in the European continent, horses did exist. So when the Spaniards come here in the 16th century, they bring the horse, and eventually the horse, starts to thrive in the environment. And those horses that were in the Spanish Southwest, that part of the Spanish Empire, they go throughout. They escape and they go throughout the plains, and it's the Plains Indians, the Sioux Indians, the Lakota that become experts at horse riding. You know what I mean? And they become some of the best horsemen out there. They were initially a nomadic tribe on foot, but this technology of the horse and their ability to tame the horse and train the horse allowed for great warriorship. So by the 1820s, they're taking advantage of this and they're taking over the Crow's territory. But like I said, the American colonists are coming out there. So by 1851, the Crow Nation, the Lakota Nation and the Cheyenne and Arapaho develop a treaty with the American government called the Fort Laramie Treaty. Now, these treaties were always broken. Like what the United States would do is the United States would make a treaty with a specific Indian nation and then go on and break that treaty, right? They would make another treaty and go on and break that treaty. The United States will say, oh, we're only going to go this far. We'll make a treaty with you. And then a couple of years later, when more settlers want more land, they will break that treaty and break that treaty and break that treaty. One of the things we didn't mention that was one of the root causes of the American Revolution, besides, taxation in England and all that, was that the English government was basically telling the American colonists, listen, we have deals with certain Indians and you can't settle beyond the Ohio River. And the Americans, they felt offended. They were like, no, we're destined to conquer this whole continent. So by the time the United States gets their independence, they do the exact same thing with Native Americans themselves. They make a treaty and say, we're not going to expand beyond this specific line, right? They established Indiana as Indian territory at one time. And then Oklahoma was established as Indian territory at one time. It was based on the idea that the Native Americans would have, at that time called Indians, the Native Americans would have a specific place that would be their own, and the United States wouldn't touch it. But each and every time that more and more settlers from the mainland United States wanted to go out there, it caused, another war, because the United States would then break the treaty that they had. So in 1851, they had this Fort Laramie Treaty with the natives. But it doesn't last, because more and more settlers come out, and then the Indians get mad, and then the United States government has to go to war with the Indians, with that specific Indian nation. So with this one, Red Cloud, it was 3 Indian nations. There was the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Sioux going to war with the United States. Interestingly enough, the word Sioux in French is a French name. It was given to them because the French were the first to encounter them, because France had, fur trading communities, like I said in the previous video, throughout the Americas. And and that was another thing that allowed the Lakota to become very, very rich. Um, and this war was conducted 1812. We did talk about that, at least in the last video. But there was an aspect to that we didn't talk about, and that was the United States going to war with the Haudenosaunee nations and Indian leader by the name of Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, um, uh, Tenskwatawa, because the British had a treaty. The British had treaties with them, with that specific nation, and he actually cursed. Uh, it's called the Curse of Tippecanoe. He actually cursed the American president at that time, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. Those two leaders, they cursed the American president and said that in every year, with a 10, every 10 years, when that president becomes a president, like say for example, okay, it happened around the time of the War of 1812. So in 1820, something will happen to the president. Then in 1830, and then in so on and so forth. And it's proven to be right because on many occasions, because Abraham Lincoln got elected in 1860, he was assassinated. JFK got elected in 1960, he was assassinated. Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980, he was attempted assassinated. Donald Trump got elected in um, they had the election in 2020. There was misgivings with that. So on each and every one, that specific Indian leader cursed us, and that's called the Curse of Tippecanoe. So yeah, we did talk about the War of 1812 in the last one, Lisa. But there were Indian battles that took place. Most famously, we talked about Andrew Jackson and the Indian battles he had with the Seminole down in Florida, that was part of the Indian Wars. So this war took place. This war, Red Cloud's War, like I said, it was the Lakota, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Northern Arapaho going against the United States government. And this war lasted from 1866 to 1868. And Henry Carrington was the general here. Now, one of the reasons why um, they may have lost was that in the midst of this war happening on the frontier out west, in the states of like Miami, states of Wyoming and Montana, for example, was because during the same time the Civil War was happening. I have an interesting book called Three Sides to the Civil War, and it talks about the Confederates, the Native American tribes that allied with each one, and the U.S. government. Interestingly enough, most Native American tribes, believe it or not, especially among what they call the five civilized nations, took the side of the Confederacy because the Confederacy had it written into their treaties when they became the five civilized nations. That if the Confederacy were to win the Civil War, they would respect Native sovereignty. So a lot of Native American nations, believe it or not, took the side of the Confederacy. Now you may think, oh, well, that's crazy. How is that possible when the Confederacy is based, as the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, said, the Confederacy, the cornerstone of the Confederacy was white supremacy. Well, among the five civilized tribes, which is the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, there were slave owners. You know, the Cherokees owned slaves, the Creeks owned slaves, the Chickasaw, a lot of slave owners among the five civilized tribes. These were the tribes that were subject to what they call in the 1830s the Trail of Tears. They were moved from their ancestral homeland across to Oklahoma because the United States had designated Oklahoma to be the land of the red man. That's what it means, right? Oklahoma. That all Indians would settle from their ancestral homelands in the southeast, like the Cherokee in Georgia, right? For example, and they would settle in Oklahoma. So the Cherokee, the last person to surrender in the American Civil War, was a Native American by the name of Stan Watie in with the Cherokee. So during this time, though, with Red Cloud, um, the United States was fighting the American Civil War. After the war was over, Indian wars continued. Indian wars continued right up until 1889, uh, the Battle of Wounded Knee. So uh, the American troops didn't, the United States government troops didn't really give it their full attention, the Indian Wars, because of what was going on between in the Civil War. But once the Civil War was over, we were allowed to, we were again focusing, continuing our mission of expanding from sea to shining sea. But this was one of the examples. Crazy Horse was involved with this as well. One of the examples where the Native Americans got the best of of the United States government. Now, what ends up happening is eventually, the United States gets their lick back, and they do defeat, these allegiances of Native Americans. As we do know, because, well, obviously. Because there was never any unity with the Native Americans. That's why the Native Americans, eventually with the Dawes Act, all tribal affiliations are diminished, right? And then by 1924, Native Americans become part of the United States. Native Americans become American citizens. That didn't happen before 1924. Before 1924, Native Americans were thought of as their own sovereign nations. They weren't part of the United States because they didn't want to be. You know what I mean? But like I said, this is one of the ones. And see, people people back east, they romanticized this because a lot of people in the eastern states like Massachusetts, New York, they had never seen a Native American because Native American populations were completely wiped out, in the early part of the country, in that area. But to see Native Americans, you had to be out west. So they romanticized the image of Native Americans, and that's where we get the popular image of Native Americans is from the Sioux, because the Sioux, which in French roughly translates to enemy of the white man, because the Lakota were so vicious and so adversarial to the United States. They were the last Indians to have a holdout. Like I said, 1898, the massacre of Wounded Knee was their last, considered what is considered the last battle of the Indian Wars. I used to have a picture of Crazy Horse and a picture of Red Cloud because, to me, they represent the Mount Rushmore of Native Americans, that resisted European colonization, European and American colonization. I look at like, yeah, thank you, Lisa. I look at, um, to tie it into a current example. We're not going to go too much into current events, but like when you look at how the United States dealt with the Native Americans, constantly wanting more and more land, and this idea of manifest destiny is kind of like how the Israelis deal with the Palestinians, where it's like, they say, oh, we're not going to take this much land, but then they send out settlers, just like the American government sent out these settlers, out west. And then it's like, okay, that gives the government the pretext. Here's our citizens living out west. We have the right now to protect them, so we have to go to war with these Native Americans. So picture Red Cloud. Picture like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse being like Yahya Sinwar or Ahmed Yassin in the Israeli example. Like they were considered the bad guys because they massacred so many American citizens in these Indian wars, but to the Native Americans, they were the good guys because they were resisting American colonization. Okay, so on to the Korean War now. The Korean War is the war that comes after World War II. Japan is completely destroyed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are dropped. Those bombs are dropped, and Japan, we kind of take over Japan. We remodel their constitution. We demilitarize them, and they kind of become made in our image, as it were. But a lot of things are happening in Asia in particular. One of the things that's happening is China has gotten itself together under a charismatic leader, Chairman Mao. And in 1949, there's a Chinese Civil War, and the communists win out. It was a civil war between a communist and a nationalist. The communists being led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists being led by Chiang Kai-shek. And when the communists win, they drive the Chinese. They drive the Chinese that were nationalists. They drive them to form Taiwan. They go across to this island, which was named in Portuguese Formosa, because it was colonized by the Portuguese for a time. But people from mainland China that are anti-communist go over to Taiwan, while after China becomes communist. This is why you always hear in the news, Taiwan, 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 that the United States is an ally of Taiwan. The United States has a two-China policy. And what that means is that the United States recognizes the sovereignty of Taiwan as an independent nation and the People's Republic, the People's Republic of China. Some nations don't recognize mainland China and just Taiwan, while other nations recognize mainland China and not Taiwan. We recognize them both, right? The Chinese government says that Taiwan is not a real territory, that is part of China. But with us, we put an umbrella over Taiwan. So if ever Taiwan is attacked by China, we have an obligation to protect them, right? This is why everybody was so spooked out when Putin was invading Ukraine. They're like, oh, well, if he feels like he could do that with Ukraine, then fuck it. In this irredentist mindset, the Chinese will invade Taiwan, and then we'll be at risk of going to war with China. So 1949, China becomes communist. And, the North Koreans that are next to them, they want to become communist too. So they finally become communist under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. And us, we're scared now because China has fallen to communism. Russia was already communist, and we're in the midst of the Cold War. After World War II, even though we were allies with Russia, as well as allies with China, they go into this ideological battle between the United States and Russia, trying to influence who will have, trying to compete for who will have the most global influence. Will it be us with our system of democracy, our system of republicanism, and our system of freedom, or will it be the communists? So they here the Russians already influenced the Koreans to become communist. So we then have to, essentially a civil war. We then have to go in our policy of containment. We want to contain communism on the in Asia, and there's a group of Koreans just like there was with the Chinese. Now the United States neglected to go into China. We said we would always back Taiwan, but during the time of the Chinese Civil War, our president, which was Harry Truman, he did not want to engage in altercation with China. You know what I mean? So he basically let China fall to communism. Now, fast forward to a year later, 1950, when the same thing starts happening with Korea, Eisenhower is in. And he doesn't have the same feelings. Eisenhower wants to prevent this by backing the democratic side of Korea. But nothing becomes of it. You know, they're competing both for influence on the Korean Peninsula. The Russians and the Chinese are backing North Korea as communist, and we're backing South Korea as democratic. But it becomes a stalemate. It's a stalemate, a standstill. Nothing is achieved because North Korea remains communist while South Korea remains democratic. And there is something called in the Korean Peninsula right now, the 38th parallel. And that's basically the border between the democratic South and the authoritarian communist North. And that still hasn't been solved. That conflict is still going on. Both sides of the conflict would like to see their ideological / economic system went out. North Korea would like for the whole Korean Peninsula to become communist, and South Korea would like for the whole Korean Peninsula to become, democratic. But neither has happened. And in 2018, which they call, which we thought was possibly the end to the Korean War, Donald Trump sits down with the descendants of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un, to hammer out this historic peace deal between the two sides of the Korean Peninsula. And for a while, it lasted, and it was really historic. And it was really, great. And we thought, hey, maybe now the South Koreans and the North Koreans will get together and somehow democracy will win out in North Korea. That doesn't happen. This war lasts from 1950 to 1953, by the way. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen, and the conflict is still going on. And North Korea is basically a real big adversary of the United States because of this. Now we move on to, that was the Korean War. That was basically a 3-year conflict, and that was a police action. Because what ends up happening after World War II is that the United States government, because see, in actuality, we need, in our government system, we need 2/3 majority in the Congress to actually declare war. But because of the circumstances, because of it's the Cold War, and because we have this policy of containment, that we want to contain the ideology of communism all around the world, what ends up happening is Congress passes a law giving the President of the United States what they call the War Power Act. In other words, the United States President, who is the commander-in-chief, can act without Congress's approval. So basically amends the system. While it won't be an official war declared, it'll do what is called a police action. So that's what the Korean War was, to contain North Korea from taking over South Korea and the whole Korean peninsula becoming communist. Now, one of the reasons why we did not win in the Korean War and it was a stalemate was because China intervened. China, also communist, they didn't want to see the Korean peninsula fall to democracy and come under the influence of the West. So they started helping the Koreans. And that was one of the reasons why it was a stalemate. Now, from there, this next war is basically the same thing. This is the same thing. Now, unlike Korea, Vietnam Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was under colonial rule by the French. We talked before about it, colonialism, European nations, coming out of Europe trying to colonize other parts of the world. Well, Vietnam, along with Cambodia, Laos, Cambodia and Laos became part of the French colony in Southeast Asia called French Indochina. But and then during World War II, for a brief time, that country was occupied by Japan. But after they achieved independence from the French, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, fights off the Japanese during World War II, fights off the French, and then now he's become communist. They've reached out to him and he's become communist. And he just like with the Korean communists, he wants the whole country to be communist too. But there's a democratic faction. There is a president, initial leader in Vietnam called Dien. He is assassinated, and before he was assassinated though, he's reaching out to the United States saying, "Hey, help me! The communists are about to take over my country. I need some help." Because the communist forces were incredible. They fought off the French and they fought off the Japanese. So they're incredible. In 1955, we decide we're going to help them and we're going to intervene on their behalf against the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists. And this war lasts from 1955 to 1975. And this war is most famous for being the first really unpopular war in American history. Other wars were pretty unpopular, but this one was super unpopular. And one of the reasons why was it was a preemptive strike. Other wars that we were involved with, besides the Korean War, other wars that we were involved with were they attacked us first. War of 1812, Civil War, World War II, World War I, they attacked us first. But here we then, nobody attacked us from Vietnam. Nobody did jack shit to us. But we had the idea that if we don't help these democratic Vietnamese against the Vietnamese communists, that the entire Vietnam would fall to communism, right? So this was a civil war going on, and we felt the need to help, our allies that align with our values. But the American people weren't feeling it because it was so far away from, their families. And because of the draft, right? They're like, we don't even know where Vietnam is on the map. Why are we fighting these people? These poor rice farmers in the middle of nowhere in Southeast Asia. Just let them be, right? They want to be communist, let them be communist, right? Who gives a fuck? That was the attitude of the American people. They were no longer buying in to this BS rhetoric like they were in the Korean War. They're like, wait a minute, this is bullshit. These were the baby boomer generation, the generation born after World War II, because after World War II, the troops come home, they start having a bunch of babies. So their children feel differently about the war in their time than the than their parents did. The parents, they felt gun-ho to fight against the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians in World War II. They felt gun-ho in Korea to fight against the communists, but they're not feeling so gun-ho in Vietnam to fight against these particular communists, because they're like, wait a minute, they didn't do anything to us. What are we doing? Right? And it was part of their teenage rebellion, right? That they were rebelling against the system. Their parents had been so patriotic, been so rah-rah to go to war in World War II, and they were different. They were a different generation. Rock and roll had come into vogue. And they were breaking down barriers in all sorts of ways. The civil rights movement was happening. You know what I mean? So they were thinking differently, and they were trying to assess, their reasoning for going to war. Like, this is bullshit. This is bullshit, guys. Vietnam didn't do anything to us. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam, the Vietnamese communists, he didn't do anything to us. As a matter of fact, on the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam from the French, he read from our Declaration of Independence. He drew influences from us, our rebellion against the British. But all of a sudden now we're fighting him. We're the big bad imperialist power. And a lot of people on the left in America were not for that. The war was highly unpopular. And one of the reasons why the war was super unpopular was because television had come into being. Television was widespread. Television was ubiquitous. So unlike any other conflict in American history, we were able to see what was actually happening on the ground through these reports on the news daily. And it did not look right, because it did not look acceptable to American citizens. Because one of the things that was different than Korea, than World War II, than all the other wars we fought, was this little band of rice farmers in Southeast Asia. But how the guerrillas in Southeast Asia, the communists, would fight is that they would have little kids be involved in the action. So one thing our people saw on TV, they're like, wow, our soldiers are out there killing kids, right? Fucking slaughtering children. It's kind of like Gaza. What the fuck is going on? And the American people were like, whoa, is this really what we're doing? We're hyped up with this anti-communist shit. All Americans are anti-communist. We'll do anything to stop communism in the world. But we won't do this. We won't violate our morals and principles by killing kids. So the war starts in 1955. In 1960, JFK is elected. And JFK is a new type of dynamic politician. He's younger. He's from the Northeast, so he's a liberal. He's a World War II veteran. He is, he's a Catholic, first Catholic ever. People are really excited, and he's really excited because he wants to prove his bona fides because one of the things that in American politics, especially when there's a war going on, whether it's ideological or whatever it is, a president never wants to appear weak. And liberals were against liberal politicians, Democratic politicians were against using force to contain communism, even if it was to contain communism. But JFK, he feels like, he has to prove he's tough. So he accelerates when he becomes president into Vietnam because he doesn't want to appear to his political adversaries as being soft on communism. But towards the end of his life, he then has second thoughts about the Vietnam War, and he wants to pull out. But then, of course, he's assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963, and now the new president, Lyndon Johnson, he's a cold warrior. He believes in going to war full force. So when he becomes president in 1963 and then gets reelected in 64 by a landslide, he then escalates and he sends more troops into Vietnam and more troops into Vietnam. Just constantly pouring more and more troops, believing that we cannot let them win. We cannot let communism win in Southeast Asia. We must do everything we can to stop it, you know. And he becomes synonymous with the war. He becomes synonymous with this very unpopular war because by the time the late 60s roll around, now Americans are really tired of this war. They're seeing the carnage every day on TV. You know, they're losing loved ones and they don't even really understand why necessarily. Because so what if Vietnam becomes communist? As long as they don't attack us, right? That was the way a lot of young people looked at it. And they blame who they blame? LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, because he accelerated. So he had this unanimous victory in 1964, basically winning all the states except for a few little ones against his opponent, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, who was a Cold War hawk. Had Barry Goldwater won, we'd have been blowing up every single communist nation, including the USSR. Because there was a slogan that Barry Goldwater's enemies, Barry Goldwater's opponent, Lyndon Johnson, used on the campaign. It says, in your heart, you know he's nuts. In other words, Barry Goldwater, and it was the political campaign was a little girl, you know, playing in the field, and then a nuclear bomb explodes, and basically the whole world ends because Barry Goldwater and them were very hard on communism. They wanted to use war as much as possible. Yep, Lisa, in your heart, you know he's nuts. And Barry Goldwater saying, in your head, you know he's right, but in your gut, you know he's nuts. In other words, what he's saying makes sense because the idea that these conservatives had at this time was that if you don't contain communism over there, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in Latin America, like in Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, where Russia and the United States almost came to war, the Cold War almost became hot. If you don't contain communism over there, communism will come over here. You know what I mean? And Goldwater also had another saying in his campaign. He said, "Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue, and extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice." In other words, so what you call me an extremist? So what you say I want to go to war and all I care about is war? I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing it for the greater good. I'm doing it to contain communism in the world. And during the 1964 campaign, somebody gives a speech called, and it's one of his greatest speeches. It was Ronald Reagan's speech. Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign was Ronald Reagan's introduction to national politics. So similar to Barack Obama, the opponent in 2004, right, 20 years and years later, the opponent was very weak. Barry Goldwater was very weak. He lost by a landslide. But one thing everybody remembers is Ronald Reagan's speech. Basically, Ronald Reagan is saying in the speech, "A time for choosing," that if he's saying the same thing, that if we don't act in Vietnam and we don't contain communism and defeat the Vietnamese communists, then communism will win, and then our civilization will be destroyed. This is what conservatives believed at the time. you know what I mean? That we have to fight communism wherever we see it around the world. And if we lose this, that's it for us. You know, that's how they sold this. But again, the American people were not necessarily buying it. And LBJ was kept escalating. So LBJ becomes president again, wins in '64, and he keeps escalating. And among the anti-war people, there's a slogan: LBJ, LBJ, how many babies did you kill today? Because we saw it on TV. We saw the babies being slaughtered. We saw the little Vietnamese children being slaughtered. We saw the women getting, raped, by the Viet Cong. And we were saying the same thing that the Israelis say about Hamas. What did they say? Oh yeah, well, we have to kill children because we don't know who's a child and who's a combatant, because the Vietnamese are fighting guerrilla tactics. So we feel like, well, fuck them, kill them all. We even killed sometimes our own side, like the side of the Vietnamese Democratic side. We sometimes killed because we couldn't tell the difference. You know what I mean? Because they're both Asian, right? Excuse this phrase. They use the word. They use the word gook, which is gook, right? It was a racial slur towards the Vietnamese. We had to kill them all. We had to kill the quote unquote gooks, right? And in Vietnam, and sometimes we would even kill our own. People. Yeah, Lisa, that. Okay, our own allies. So this war becomes very unpopular, and by 1968, we have what is called the Tet Offensive, because one of the reasons why LBJ expanded and accelerated in '64, he said anyway. This was his excuse. He said, and the reason was given that the Vietnamese attacked an American ship in what they call the Gulf of Tonkin, right? In this Gulf near Vietnam. But we later found out that was a lie. And the Gulf of Tonkin didn't happen. We were never attacked by the Vietnamese. They were just making that bullshit up to give us a justification to go to war. So by 1968, they're having their New Year's celebration, the Vietnamese New Year, and we attack in the Tet Offensive, one of the worst massacres of a people that could ever happen. And that's when LBJ becomes so unpopular with the people that he declines his party's nomination for presidency for the second term. He drops out because he's so unpopular and the war is so unpopular, right? Famously, Muhammad Ali didn't want to serve in the war. He said, ain't no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word. Famously, Martin Luther King, after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and '65, he becomes an anti-war activist. Everybody's pretty much against it. They're burning their draft cards. Some of them are moving to Canada. Some of them do dodge the draft, like Donald Trump, like Bill Clinton. A lot of these people do dodge the draft. They have money. But okay, then by 1970. By 1968, there's another election. Like I said, Johnson drops out. Nixon campaigns as a Republican, as a peace president. He wants to pull out of Vietnam. One of the famous things we always see Nixon doing this, right? Peace. Famous picture of him getting off the plane doing peace. He wants to pull out. At least that's what he says, right? But he gets in 1968, he wins, and we still keep accelerating. We still keep fighting. Not only do we fight there, but we expanded to the neighboring country of Cambodia, going against their communist regime, led by a dictator by the name of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge. And the movie Hamburger Hill is about that. We'd start bombing them. So Nixon, he campaigned as a peace president, but he lied. And he accelerated, after Lyndon Johnson. So, but by 1973, the war is a failure. We're losing more and more troops each day. As each and every day passes, the United States citizens become more and more disillusioned with the war. So Watergate happens. We talked about Watergate, Lisa and I, where there's an election, the 1972 election between President Nixon and George McGovern, where President Nixon has some of his people uh, break in to the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, is staying and spy on his opponent, George McGovern. He basically, he cheated. He was cheating. He was using spies to win, because Nixon was a very paranoid individual. Nixon was from a poor background in California. He started his career, in the early 50s, as a government official. Then went on to be the vice president for Dwight D. Eisenhower. Went on to run for president in 1960, lost to JFK, and then kind of stayed out of politics again until 1968, when he finally wins. And when he finally wins, he wants to hold on to power, but he's so paranoid that he basically tapes all of his interactions with his White House aides, and it is later heard, through these tapes, that he had told them to invade the Watergate, break into the Watergate Hotel, make it look like a burglary, and then get this information on George McGovern. He taped everything. Now, why did he tape that? I don't know. He put himself in a fucking hole by doing that. You know what I mean? Because now we have it on tape that you did that. Woodward and Bernstein. Bob Woodward, the guy that wrote all these presidential books, he was the one to break the news that Nixon had done this. And the American public was so shamed by this that Nixon, before he gets impeached, he himself resigns in 1973. And it was stupid for him to break into the Watergate Hotel, because he was going to win anyway. He won in 1972 re-election by a landslide. Why cheat? He only fucked himself. George McGovern was a real hardcore liberal, and George McGovern was campaigning on an immediate pullout of the war in Vietnam. And he lost, by a landslide. So Nixon was going to win anyway in 72. Why he cheated, or why he thought he needed to cheat, always made no sense to me. But he was just that paranoid of an individual. You know what I mean? So before he resigns, he negotiates the pullout in April of 73 from Vietnam. Now, fast forward 2 years later. Now, keep in mind, we've been fighting this war for almost 20 years, and it's very unpopular with the people. So as America finally pulls out completely, a gradual pullout by 73 and a complete pullout by 75, guess what happens? All that fighting for nothing. The communists take 1975, the capital city of Vietnam, Saigon, falls, and the communists take over anyway. So 20 years of fighting for nothing. Millions of American lives lost for nothing. Turmoil in our streets, riots in our streets, like at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. For what? For nothing. They won. You know what I mean? They fucking won. And today Vietnam is a communist country. Ironically enough, we now have peace with the Vietnamese. Even though they're communist, we go over there. There are museums in Vietnam that commemorate, us, the American troops, because a lot of people in Vietnam are half American and half Asian. They're the children of these soldiers that were over there and having babies, sometimes by, raping women, in Vietnam. So there's this half Vietnamese, half American, children and kids. Really weird stuff. So that was Vietnam. 2 years later, the Democratic side of Vietnam loses. So the war was all for nothing. Saigon fell, right? The communists won. So the Bay of Pigs invasion, Lisa's talking about. Okay, now here we got to backtrack. Again, communism, a main issue. But now, in 1959, communism comes to our shores in Cuba, our side of the hemisphere in Cuba. Now, Cuba and the United States had been an interesting story because, like we said, in the Spanish American War, it was the United States that helped Cuba achieve its independence from Spain, and we always maintain a cordial relationship with the Cubans, looking at Cuba like a big brother, little brother type situation. And their president, Batista, had helped us during World War II. And the mob, the American mafia, had a lot of connections in Cuba because Cuba was offshore, not subject to American taxes. And the Cuban government under Batista was really corrupt. He allowed a lot of the American mafia to basically make Havana and make Cuba like a little mini Las Vegas of the Caribbean. And it was really exploitative to the the native Cuban population, especially darker skinned Cubans, that were highly discriminated against, and the peasantry. So Cubans were tired of it. They were tired of Batista's influence. They were tired of American influence. So a man named Fidel Castro comes to power, and he starts the what they call the Cuban Revolution to overthrow Batista. And initially, or at least he didn't say he was anyway, a communist, right? So, but we didn't want to help him because Batista was our ally. So since we don't want to help him overthrow Batista, who does he go to? The next best other party, the other superpower in the world, the USSR. And he develops a friendship with the USSR, and eventually the Cuban Revolution becomes a communist revolution, and the communists take over in 59. Now, America views this as a tremendous loss, right? Because it's one thing to fight communism in Asia. It's one thing to fight communism in Europe. Parts of Europe and parts of Asia had already fallen to communism, right? But now we're talking about communism in the Americas. We're talking about our own doorstep. 90 miles from Florida is Cuba. Now, this is getting really scary. So, again, Kennedy comes in, and again, he wants to appear tough on communism. So what he does is he sends a group of Cuban dissidees, because communism, there were a lot of rich people in pre-communist Cuba under Batista, a lot of Cubans that worked for the mob. But communism, its main aim is to make society more equal, to each according to his ability, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. That is the mantra of communism and Marxism. So it tries to even the playing field. It tries to eliminate private property, and a lot of the Cubans that were rich in the upper class of Cuban society come to the United States, and they come to Miami. And Kennedy's plan is to use these ex-Cubans, use these Cuban dissidents to overthrow Fidel Castro by invading Cuba and trying to do that. Particularly this individual by the name of Jose Miguel Batlle. He's a former Cuban policeman. He comes to the United States, becomes part of the anti-Castro militia, and he leads the charge against overthrowing Fidel. But it doesn't work. It's a failure. It doesn't work. They're eventually captured, and a lot of them are, killed, imprisoned, or sent back to Miami. It was a failed coup trying to overthrow Fidel, and it doesn't happen. And we tried over and over for years and years. Every president would try to overthrow Fidel Castro, and it never happened. And finally, in 2016, Fidel dies of natural causes. You tried to get me, but you never could, you motherfuckers. He outlived Kennedy, he outlived Johnson, he outlived Nixon, he outlived Ford, he outlived Carter, Clinton, Bush 1, Bush 2, and Obama, and then he died, um, around the time of Trump, and the communist regime in Cuba still has not been overthrown. Miguel Diaz-Canel and Castro's brother, eventually took over after he died. So that was a tremendous loss, and because of that loss, Lisa, lost the Demo- that lost the democratic vote for many Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans felt like Kennedy botched that shit. You know what I mean? He felt like they felt like the Democrats betrayed them. So that's why most Cubans are Republicans, because they uh, they they trust the Republican Party more when it comes to this. You know what I mean? They lost faith in the Democrats. They felt like the Democrats weren't pushing hard enough to liberate Cuba from communism. Oddly enough, when when Castro took power and these Cubans were forced out to go to Miami as exile, a lot of Cubans brought their house keys. They brought their house keys with them to Florida because they thought, hey, we can't be gone this long. You know what I mean? The United States is going to step right in. They're going to overthrow Fidel Castro, and that'd be the end of communism, and we can come back to our old homes. Well, they're still hanging on to those keys because it's been years, and the communists are still in power, even after Fidel died. I don't think we'll ever see the end of communism in Cuba, to be honest with you. I always say if it were to happen, I don't think a lot of Cuban Americans would want to go back anyway. It's been too many years. You know what I mean? But that's interesting. That's interesting to see the end of. When it comes to that. But the communist revolution in Cuba did have its benefits. It achieved equality of poor Cubans and richer Cubans in the society. But in the United States, since they failed with the invasion, one of the ways they tried to do it was they imposed an embargo, a trade embargo. So basically, we can't trade with Cuba. None of our citizens, none of our people that are American citizens can go to Cuba with an American passport. We have to go. If we, okay, hang on. If we want to go to Cuba, we have to go through another Latin American country to get to Cuba because we don't have diplomatic ties. Now, in 2015, Barack Obama did open up the communications with Cuba, and somewhat to the anger of many Cuban Americans. You would think it'd be kind of cool because now they'll be able to come back, back and forth, uh, visiting their families in Cuba. For years and years, they weren't allowed to do that. But a lot of Cuban politicians at the time, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and a lot of the Cubans in Florida, they objected to it because to them, that is legitimizing the communist regime. If you open up relations with them, and they don't want that. They don't want the regime to be legitimized by the United States at all. They want regime change in Cuba. And really, the only way that's going to happen is if the United States launches yet another Bay of Pigs invasion. trying to overthrow the communists again, which I think Donald Trump I think Donald Trump wants to do that. You know what I mean? Like there's talk of him doing that, but how would that make him look on the world stage? That make him look like a complete villain, right? He did it with Venezuela, so I don't think he cares. But Cuba doesn't have petroleum, so they don't have much. They don't have much to offer in terms of natural resources like Venezuela does. So he's probably not going to do that. But by reimposing the embargo, his aim was to starve them out, basically, in hopes that they'll change. We had two ways of dealing with communist nations. On the one hand, Nixon, his way of dealing with communism in China was to open up communications with the Chinese and open diplomatic relationship with the Chinese. That's why he went to China, first American president to go to China in 1972. Or we just starved them out like we do with Cuba. You know what I mean? And hope that they'll change. Neither one has happened. Both China and Cuba are still communist nations, so neither philosophy has really worked. You know what I mean? There's really nothing to do with that. Unless the people want to change it, then the government will change, or the regime will change. Going on to the Afghanistan war. Now, the Afghanistan war lasted from 2001 to 2021. Now, here is the background behind this. Much like Cuba, springboarding off our last war that we talked about, much like Cuba and Vietnam, the Soviet Union had their own Vietnam. The Soviet Union's Vietnam was Afghanistan. The Soviet Union, again, was our primary ideological our rival during the Cold War. And all of the countries that surround Afghanistan were all part of the USSR. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all these stand countries in Central Asia, they were all part of the Soviet Union. So, and parts of Afghanistan, right? Now, Afghans, they don't want to be under communism. You know, they don't want to be under communism, right? So they start rebelling. So protect their interests in the region, just like we wanted to protect our interests in Southeast Asia and limit the influence of the Russians on the Chinese in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, or in Cuba. They want to limit our influence in Afghanistan, right? So, and stop the Afghans from rebelling. So in 1979, they invade Afghanistan. Russia invades Afghanistan. And this puts a tremendous strain on the Russian economy. And just like with the Vietnam War with us, the war is very unpopular with the Russians throughout the 1980s. And just like with us, we were going through our counterculture change of kids challenging the status quo in America during Vietnam. Well, they were going through that in Russia as well. People were demanding more rights, more freedoms. Couple that with them losing this war in Afghanistan, it was a made for disaster. So Afghanistan was their Vietnam. Our Vietnam was Vietnam. Our enemy's Vietnam, the Russians' Vietnam, was Afghanistan. And we started sending money and supplies and weapons to a group known as the Mujahideen. Afghanistan is a Muslim country, of course, right? And since communists are atheists, right, and they don't believe in religion, we felt like the best way to defeat them is to sponsor these jihadists, these mujahideen, these holy warriors to go against the Russians when they invade in 1979, right? And that's what we do. We arm the mujahideen in Afghanistan. So when the mujahideen win in Afghanistan and Russia loses, Now there is this contingency in Afghanistan that is highly religious, fanatical religionist, right? Led by Osama bin Laden. It was during this war, Afghanistan and the Russians, that Osama bin Laden starts working for the United States because we're allies with the people that he's helping, which is the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So he then becomes our close ally, and we help him defeat the Russians. He becomes a CIA operative. He starts working with the United States in an attempt to defeat these Russians. But after the war is over, the Mujahideen, the holy warriors, the jihadists, they're still there. They're still ruling in Afghanistan. So in 1996, a group of students from Pakistan that was trained by them in Pakistani madrasas, which are Islamic schools, they called the Taliban. Talib in Arabic means student. These group of students overtake the Afghan government, and they start to impose Sharia law, a strict interpretation of Sharia law in Afghanistan. That's when they come to power in 1996. Now, with Osama bin Laden, trained by us, CIA operative, everything by us, right? And he's our ally. He's our ally against the Russians. But then the Gulf War rolls around. And in the Gulf War, we're fighting against Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, trying to, monopolize their oil, take their oil. He invades Kuwait in the summer of 1990, and then we declare war on him in 1991 under President Bush. During this time, the United States has bases in Saudi Arabia, and the American troops go to these bases in Saudi Arabia, and basically they cross over to the holy cities of in the Muslim religion of Mecca and Medina. And it is a violation in the Muslim religion for anybody to go to with military machines to go to these holy cities, and it is also a violation for anybody who is not Muslim to even go to these cities. So bin Laden hears about this, and bin Laden is pissed. He's pissed off with his home country of Saudi Arabia, and he's pissed off with the United States, but he feel like they betray his trust. So he founds a guerrilla group called Al Qaeda, which in Arabic means the base. And this group becomes a terrorist organization, terrorizing many places in the United States as well as our embassies. He carries out a strike, a bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center. He carries out a bombing of the two American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, an attack on the USS Cole in 1999. He basically starts attacking us everywhere. But the worst one was September 11, 2001, in which hijackers hijacked planes, two planes, and crashed those two planes into the Twin Towers. That's a September 11th attack. Now, during this time, bin Laden is hiding out in Afghanistan because initially, when he started to do shit to the United States, he was hiding in Sudan. And President Clinton tried to capture him in Sudan, but didn't want to really bomb civilians in Sudan in retaliation for the attack on the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. But he didn't want to bomb civilians, so he doesn't get them. So bin Laden feels like, hey, I got to hightail out of there. I'm going back to where I became most famous in Afghanistan. And the Taliban's already in power. They harbor him. And from there, he masterminds 9/11. And immediately after 9/11, we feel like we have to get them. So we immediately defeat the Taliban. Mullah Omar, who was the head of the Taliban and the de facto head of state in Afghanistan. Afghanistan really doesn't have a government per se because Afghanistan is very tribal. Afghanistan is probably one of the most tribal societies of all time. So tribal government and ethnic affiliation, the people that are leading the Taliban and the people that are known as Afghans, they're the Pashtun ethnic group. They share a border with Pakistan. some of the Pakistanis are ethnic. Pardon me, guys, I got allergies. Ethnic, um, ethnic Afghans. They speak the Pashtun language. They are they follow a strict tribal interpretation that even predates Islam in the country, which is called Pashtunwali, which is like their legal code. And so there really is no head of state, but the only one that is really the head of state is Mullah Omar. They kill Mullah Omar, and the hunt begins for Osama bin Laden, to try and get revenge for 9/11 attacks. We don't end up capturing him, and what he ends up doing is he ends up going to Pakistan, to Abbottabad, Pakistan, because again, like I said, part of one of the major ethnic groups in Pakistan are Afghans. Many people don't know this, but Pakistan is basically an acronym. Pakistan stands for Punjabis, Afghans, and Kashmiris, the three main ethnic groups that were supposed to make up this Muslim nation in South Asia. So there's a lot of Afghans in Pakistan. So some of those Afghans in Pakistan smuggle bin Laden across the border, and he begins to hide on it in Pakistan. So while the Pakistani government is telling us, led by Pervez Musharraf at the time, is telling us, yeah, we're helping you, we're going to try to find him, we're doing our best, they're really hiding him, because in actuality, many of the Pakistani citizens feel the same way about the West and about Islam, in conflict with the West, as the Afghans did. But they want to maintain, their friendship with America, because the relationship between Pakistan and America goes way back to when Pakistan became a country in 1947. Because a little bit of background with Pakistan, how it became a country was it was originally India, and then it was partitioned between the Muslims and the Hindus. And India, the Hindus in the country founded the Republic of India, while the Muslims in the country founded the Republic of Pakistan. And India's initial leadership, like Jawaharlal Nehru or Mahatma Gandhi, they were socialists. So they were more aligned ideologically and politically with the Soviet Union, while Pakistan, their main adversary, was aligned with the United States, fighting against communism, right? Just like with Afghanistan. So communism is over. Soviet Union collapses in 1991. So now, but we still have this friendship with Pakistan. But now we're fighting Islam. We're fighting Islamic extremists. The enemy is different. And Pakistan is saying that they're helping us, but they're really not helping us at all. So it takes 10 years for us to finally capture Osama bin Laden. And under Barack Obama, we do capture him, right, in 2011. And we get revenge for 9/11 attacks. Now, like Lisa said, Afghanistan is the longest war. Now, bin Laden is captured. Bin Laden is killed. You would think that'd be the end of this conflict, right? That's it. No. Because there's something very valuable that Afghanistan has. And it's not oil like it was in Iraq. It is opium. Opium. Opium is used to make pain medicine. It's used to make heroin. It's used to make pain medicine. It is a highly addictive narcotic. And it is manufactured in this country, in Afghanistan. And during this time, there is a spike in the opioid crisis, which was started by the Purdue family when they put out OxyContin in the late 90s. Everybody's becoming rich. They're getting people hooked. And we need that raw material to supply us for that, right? And so that's why we stay there, to basically take control of the opium fields. That is one of the reasons why we stay there, to take control of the opium fields, because we feel like if we leave, then the Taliban will come back in power and they will put us basically put the kibosh on it. So, but because the Taliban, yes, Lisa, the Taliban are religious. They're not going to want people using dope. Right, yeah. They're not going to want people using dope in their country. They're Muslims. They use the Taliban did use the drug trade, the opium trade to become, to become in power, right? When they were trying to, trying to become, uh, trying to take over the country, they did use the drug trade. But once they got in, Sharia law, strict Islamist, they canceled it all, right? They fucking put the kibosh on it. But we come in, they're out of power, and Hamad Karzai, which was our appointed puppet that we put in power after they were, because we got rid of them with the quickness. I remember Lisa in 2001, we come into the program where we met and saying, man, they just captured Afghanistan. And that was in a matter of weeks right after 9/11. But the problem was that even though a lot of people didn't like the Taliban and the rules that the Taliban made, like they banned music, they banned kites, flying kites. They, of course, women in long, what they call burqas, right? The long dresses. They banned women out in public and everything. People didn't really like that, but at the same time, they didn't want to be occupied either, right? In perpetuity, right? So the longer the United States stayed, the more and more the Taliban became popular again. You know what I mean? Because it's like this government that was headed by Hamad Karzai and later Ashraf Ghani was not popular. And just like the Vietnam War, after bin Laden was captured, this war, which they call the Forever War, wasn't popular either. Like, why are we still staying there? What the fuck? Why? You know what I mean? Like, you say it's to prevent Islamic fundamentalism, but it's just like communism in. Right, Lisa's right. And we're trying to stop the opioid abuse in the United States and the U.S. over there, taking it to bring it here. Yep. Yeah. So we're like, why? Yeah, they're going to become Islamist, but just like with the communists in Vietnam, as long as they keep it to themselves and they don't do anything to us, who gives a fuck? Let them govern themselves. Let them govern themselves the way they want to govern themselves. So each and every president is just like Vietnam. It's a complete repeat of history. Obama saying he's going to pull out eventually. He's going to pull out eventually. Trump, just like Nixon, campaigning as a peace president. I will pull out. But just like Nixon, what does Trump do? He stays. Trump, throughout his whole presidency, stayed. He did not pull out of Afghanistan. Right? Finally, he is defeated, and he was defeated. Let me just put an end to that. He was defeated in 2020. The idea that the election was stolen in 2020 is a complete lie. That's similar to the lie that Hitler told that the Jewish people stabbed him in the back. Stabbed the German people in the back that caused the Germans to lose World War I. 2020 is the lie by MAGA. I don't care what you hear. I don't care what conspiracy theories will develop in the future, because what ends up happening is that as time goes by, people start to doubt the historical orthodoxies, because we've been lied to so many times. We start to doubt the historical orthodoxies. So eventually, what might happen in the future is people will say Trump never really lost that election in 2020. It was stolen. Now, hopefully that doesn't become a thing, but he stayed in. All throughout his first term, he talked about pulling out of Afghanistan, but he still stayed in. He didn't try to pull out, so he loses. And then Biden becomes president in 2021, and finally Biden pulls out. Now, the results of that were worse than Vietnam. Worse than Vietnam. Vietnam, it took like 2 years for our allies to fail in the country to, our objective there to never happen, and our enemies there, the people we were fighting, to finally take over. Here, it happens within a matter of hours. Ashraf Ghani, our ally there, is run off, and the entire Taliban invades his office. And the Taliban, as we speak today, is back in power in Afghanistan, led by Humatullah Akhundzada, and going to war with Pakistan, our ally. So basically, our objectives there were never achieved. And a lot of people blame Biden for it, but really the person to blame is Donald Trump. Because when Donald Trump started to negotiate these deals of the pullout for Afghanistan, because he was negotiating the pullout of Afghanistan in like 2018, 2019, he was talking to the Taliban. He was basically saying, fuck it, we lost. The Taliban is really popular once again in this country. Let's just give it back to the Taliban, and that'd be the end of it. And that's what happened. The Taliban is back now, and worse than they were before, worse than they were when they took power in the 90s in Afghanistan. They made all kinds of promises. Their spokesperson in 2021 said there would be a different Afghanistan. They would take, more freedom for women, more freedom for religious minorities, like Jewish people or Shias, right? The Hazara ethnic group, famous ethnic group that is descended from the Mongols. That they're Afghans, but they look Asian, right? And they're Shia Muslims. They are the opposite sect of the Taliban. There was promises that their rights would be respected, but the Taliban lied. Once they got in power, they became worse than ever. And everybody blamed Joe Biden for the way he botched the pullout. But really, it was Trump. Trump was planning, had Trump won the election in 2020, Trump was planning to hand the rings over to the Taliban. We failed. You know what I mean? We tried to do this ever since 1945. Because it was so successful in 1945, when we went into Japan and we did a regime change in Japan, and the Japanese culture, once the atomic bombs happened, the Japanese, they dropped all their animosity. After that happened, you never saw the Japanese try to rise up from the Americans and American rule. The Japanese changed. You know what I mean? They became completely democratic. So we think, and a similar thing happened with the Germans. Right here, Germany was split in two, the Berlin Wall. East Germany was controlled by Russia, the communists, and West Germany was controlled by us and the Allies. But Germany, after that was over, after the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, Germany becomes a free country again. So it was successful in Germany, it was successful in Japan. We used our influence to reshape the culture of those two places. So we thought we could do the same thing with Afghanistan. But the problem is different. It's a different society. Japan is Shinto religion, Buddhist religion, pacifistic religions. Germany is already a Western society. Yeah, they have fascism or whatever, but they were already a Western society. It wouldn't take much for them to go back to the way they were, during the Weimar Republic in years before Adolf Hitler and before the communists. When it comes to Muslim societies, that's something different. Islam is a religion, obviously, but it's not just a religion. It is a political system. There is something in Islam called Sharia law. Now, a lot of our politicians use the word Sharia law as a scare tactic, an Islamophobic tactic to say that white people from predominantly Muslim societies shouldn't immigrate to the United States or the West more generally, because, but there is a thing called Sharia law. In the Muslim religion, politics and religion are not separated. It's not like America where there's separation of church and state. No, they're integrated. So Muslims are not going to accept a completely westernized democracy where religion doesn't play a role. There are some Muslim countries like Iran, for example, before 1979, before the Iranian Revolution, where under the Shah, where they were secular, but they were secularized, or Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey in 1922 becomes an independent nation under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and they completely westernized. They banned hijabs, they banned Islamic clothing, and of course the Russians did this too in the Islamic societies in Central Asia. But they had to be forced to do that. The Shah was a dictatorship propped up by the United States. The Ataturks was a dictatorship in Turkey, backed up by the West. Muslims in general, they want to have religion in their government. They want to have that. They vote for it a lot of times. In 2011, there was something called the Arab Spring in the Arab world, where people were rising up against their governments. And in Egypt, Obama had backed the rebels in Egypt, right, during the Arab Spring in 2011 against longtime Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. And as soon as they got in power in Egypt, as soon as they overthrew Mubarak, they didn't go for a more democratic society because Mubarak was a dictator. They didn't go for a more democratic society, a more Western society. They went completely to the Islamic, to the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed al-Morsi. That famous, it's a viral clip now of that woman. She says, it goes around the internet. It's a woman in Egypt, the Tahrir Square uprising in 2011, where she says, Obama, remember September 11th, 2001? No, Obama. Basically saying that they didn't like Obama because he backed the secular people in Egypt. They were happy with they weren't thrilled with Mubarak, but they prefer Mubarak to the Muslim Brotherhood, right? When the Muslim Brotherhood takes power in Egypt, of course, who suffers is women, secular people, and minorities, under these Islamic regimes. So Muslims fighting wars is part of the Muslim religion. Now, I'm not going to be Islamophobic and say the entire religion is warlike. Obviously, that's not the case, but it is a religion that is political. It's more political than Christianity. Christianity is not political really at all, but Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was a government official. Don't forget that he had his own state, he had his own government in Medina. You know what I mean? Like, it's a legal religion. What do you want? It's a religion that is political. You sit down with a Muslim person, you're ultimately going to get involved in a discussion about politics in some way. You know what I mean? Because Islam is inherently political, more so than Christianity, more so than other religions. So Muslims kind of want this. You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry to say. Bush thought he could be the savior of the Middle East. He could democratize the Middle East, and then Obama thought that too, and they both were wrong. Trump now thinks that. This is the thing with Gaza. What happens when the Israelis pull out in 2005 with Gaza? They elect an extremist Muslim regime, Hamas. So it happens each and every time. And it also happened in this war that we're going to talk about next, and that is the Iraq War. It's tied in with the Afghanistan war because of that, this is a new major epoch in American war. Like we talked about the Indian Wars, there were a series of conflicts. We talked about the Cold War, a series of conflicts like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, Korea. Now, communism has fallen. In 1991, the Soviet Union breaks up, and there's no more communism. So we need a new boogeyman, a new enemy. So September the 11th, 2001 provides that new enemy. It's now Islamic terror. We're fighting now against Islam, Islamist, political Islam. And because we were attacked, the Bush administration decides, who's the next threat to global democracy and American hegemony in the region? It is Iraq. Now, this makes no sense because Iraq was headed by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was a secularist. Saddam Hussein belonged to a party, an Arab nationalist party called the Ba'ath Party. So when Saddam takes power in Iraq in the 70s, he brings this Arab nationalism to the government. And it's a secular ideology. It's not a religious ideology. Saddam was not a religious fanatic. He was not even that really religious. He was an Arab nationalist. The Arab nationalist movement, the Ba'ath movement, was started by an Arab Christian, Michael Aflaq, in Lebanon. So of course it had nothing to do with religion. So why would Saddam Hussein, who's a secularist, be allying with Al Qaeda? That made no sense. He cracked down on Islamic militants in his country. He punished Islamic militants in his country, the Ba'athist Party. They didn't want an Islamist regime to pop up in Iraq. But we were lied to by the American people. And because the American people don't know much about this part of the world, we believed it. We believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was beginning to develop a nuclear bomb. And then who was telling us this a lot? Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu was going around telling us Saddam Hussein is about to develop nuclear capabilities any day now. Next week, Saddam Hussein will have the nuclear bomb, and it will be a threat to America as well as the state of Israel. And we believed it. We believed Bibi Netanyahu. So Bush, Lisa says we were lied to a lot of times. Bush convinces us, hey, he's harboring terrorists too, right? Now, he wasn't harboring terrorists in his country because, again, he wanted nothing to do with Al Qaeda. Why would he want something to do with Al Qaeda? What he was doing was, he was not religious, but just like every other Arab country, he considered the state of Israel as a blot on his people, right? So what he was doing was he was sponsoring terrorist attacks against Israel to try and overthrow Israel. And during the Gulf War, he even fired missiles at Tel Aviv, right? Israel's main city. So that he was doing. But him having nuclear capabilities or weapons of mass destruction, that was a lie. So I sat there in social studies class watching Colin Powell give the speech saying that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, telling us that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and we all bought it. So in the beginning, every American politician, was Democrat or Republican, was behind the invasion of Iraq. April 9th, 2003, the statue of Saddam comes down. There was a big statue of Saddam like this, holding his hand out. The statue of Saddam comes down, and it seems to be all good, right? Well, no. Because now Saddam was a brutal dictator, but he kept the country together, right? Iraq is bifurcated by a bunch of different ethnic and religious groups. Saddam was an Arab Sunni. He was part of the Sunni sect of Islam, but the majority of the country is Shia Muslims, right? Especially in the South. So now Saddam is not there anymore. So now the Americans try to create a country where every ethnic group is equally represented. You have Sunnis. The three main ones are Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. Kurds are a different ethnic group. They can be Sunni or Shia, but they're a different ethnic group that is distinct from Arab Iraqis. And they don't have their own country. They were promised their own country at the end of World War I for helping out the Allies, and they never got it. And their territory, Kurdistan, is split up between various different countries, between Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. So Kurds exist in all these countries as persecuted minorities. But during the war in the early 90s, Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds. So he was against the Kurds. He tried to genocide the Kurds in his country. So we come in, we topple him. But how do we maintain power? How do we make sure that every group is represented? The Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, and the Kurds, and plus all the other groups like Assyrian Christians, Chaldeans, Yazidis, all these other smaller groups. But these are the three main groups. How do we maintain power without without resorting to the kind of dictatorial things that Saddam was guilty of? You know what I mean? And we never really figured it out because the Shia Muslims, because Saddam was Sunni, he oppressed the Shia Muslims a lot in the south, in places like Basra, right, in Iraq. And they, with help from Iran, they rose up. The neighboring country, Iran, the Shias rise up. And in 2006, there's a major insurgence in the city of Fallujah led by the Shia leader Muqtada al-Sadr. Now, that's them. And the Sunnis, after Saddam is killed in 2006, the Sunnis are left with nowhere to go. So eventually, the Arab Spring happens in 2011. And Barack Obama wants to do in Syria exactly what he did in Egypt and overthrow the dictator of Syria who has Russian backing and Russian ties, Bashar al-Assad. So Bashar al-Assad is a Shia. He's an Alawite, which is a branch of the Shia religion. So of course he's a Shia in power in Syria, and he's oppressing the Sunnis. So Obama tries to help the rebels, the Sunni rebels, and part of the Sunni rebels, are coming over from Iraq, and they create the Islamics in 2000 and it was created in 1999 initially, but they gained power. They filled the vacuum of leadership in Iraq, and they gained power in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which we know that acronym, ISIS, right? Are the Sunni rebels against Assad and the Sunni rebels against the Shia rebels in Iraq. And they basically want to restore the Islamic Caliphate, and they do gain power in parts of Iraq and parts of Syria. Now, the ones that suffer from their reign are the Shias, obviously, the Kurds, because they're allies of the United States, and the Yazidis, which is a minority religious group in Iraq. So we pull out of Afghanistan Iraq. Obama kept his promise, and he did pull out. But in that power vacuum came Mossad al-Zarqawi and ISIS. These extremist Sunnis. Really crazy stuff. And Iraq still hasn't gotten together. So we're battling the Iranians that are influencing the Shias and funding the Shias, and the Sunnis are being led by ISIS, trying to take over both Iraq and Syria, and consolidate it into one country. In many ways, the Arab Spring was a complete disaster. Barack Obama thought, like George Bush thought before him, that this would lead to democracy in Iraq and in the Middle East, but by supporting the rebellions and thinking the rebellions had the best interests at heart. But really, a lot of these rebellions against the likes of Bashar al-Assad or Saddam or Hosni Mubarak in the Middle East, they were rebelling against them because these dictators were outlawing, Islamic groups that wanted to impose Sharia law. So you give the rebels power. Most of the time, the rebels that are rebelling against these guys are extremist Muslims, like was the case with Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, or like the case with Iraq and ISIS on Syria and ISIS. So basically, by helping the rebels, by helping the Sunni rebels in Iraq, and by pulling out as fast as we did, we basically gave ISIS free reign, and ISIS became a menace to society throughout all of the late 2010s. So Iraq was a complete disaster. We never should have been there. It was a mistake. Now, a lot of people think that it was something more personal for, it was the influence of Israel, of course, and it was the desire for oil, because we stopped Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, but we didn't take the oil fields, right? So many people felt like those were the two objectives why Bush invaded Iraq and lied to us. But I think it was something more personal. George Bush's father was the one who tried to stop Saddam Hussein, who led the invasion of the Persian Gulf to stop Saddam Hussein, right, from invading Kuwait, right? But what he didn't do is he didn't take it all the way. He didn't overthrow Saddam. But Saddam's people did try to have Bush the father, killed. So he tried to have this man's father killed. So of course, Bush, when he gets in power in 2000, he's going to want to take revenge on Saddam, but by any means necessary, by having us invade Iraq. But it really caused a lot of instability in the region, and that was one of the main reasons why ISIS, came to power in 2011. So that's why that was a failure. And just like with Afghanistan and just like with Vietnam, this war was also very unpopular with the American people, because once we figured out that there were no weapons of mass destruction and that we were lied to, much like the Gulf of Tonkin incident with Vietnam, we're like, well, why are we still there in Afghanistan? Why are we still there? Like, what is it? A lot of it had to do with the oil contractors. Dick Cheney was an oil man involved with that. Dick Cheney was really the one pulling the strings for W, pushing for the Iraq war. A lot of it had to do with Israel, because Israel wants these countries destabilized. They don't want these countries, being united with each other, because if these countries are united against each other, they'll go against Israel, and then Israel will have trouble. So Israel is always trying, Israel won't exist. So Israel is always trying to get us into war to overthrow this Islamic regime. Like each and every time there's a new boogeyman. Libya is the guy, Gaddafi's the guy, Saddam is the guy, Iran is the guy. Netanyahu and other Israeli prime ministers are always going on these tours, saying this is the next biggest threat to democracy in the Middle East. This is the next biggest threat to democracy in the Middle East. We got to overthrow this guy. We got to overthrow that guy. And it causes tremendous instability in the Middle East. Tremendous instability in the Middle East. And that's what they did in Iraq. Iraq was a total failure. And we kind of figured out, he has no WMDs. This is a bullshit war. And Americans were against it. Which is one of the reasons why George W. Bush was so unpopular when he left office, because he stood on the ship and he declared victory, because he thought overthrowing Saddam was going to be it. And once we overthrew Saddam, they just magically snapped into, a democratic society that had representation from all the groups in Iraq. And that just wasn't going to happen. That was a dream. It wasn't going to happen. So, that's it. So, yeah, we were lied to a lot of times, Lisa, absolutely. And a lot of people say that Iraq was better when Saddam was there. Was Saddam a vicious dictator? Yes. Did he keep the Islamists and the Al Qaeda's and later on ISIS? Because ISIS is a splinter group from Al Qaeda. After bin Laden dies, he's the leader of Al Qaeda. There is a war between his mentor, Ayman al Zawahiri, bin Laden's mentor, Ayman al Zawahiri, and this other Jordanian prisoner, Musab al Zarqawi, over what they should do, who should assume power. Zarqawi is then kicked out, and that's when he forms ISIS, which is going to be 10 times worse. ISIS is than with Al Qaeda. Daesh is the Arabic word, or sometimes ISIL. You'll hear ISIL, Islamic State of the Levant, because they want to overtake Israel as well, eventually. But they were severely diminished by President Trump. Well, that's one thing I will say. That Trump and Barack Obama, really went hard on trying to destroy ISIS. They still exist, but they aren't as popular or as widespread doing this mischief around the world like they were in the late 2010s when they were bombing, France, bombing, nightclubs here and there, Nepal's nightclub shooting. They aren't that big, but we should have never been there. We lost because we didn't, like Bush said. There was an interview with Bush where his people are going over, the history of Iraq, because you got to understand the history of the region to really understand why these groups, beef. The Sunni and Shia split happened in Iraq. You know what I mean? So basically, they're saying, well, there's been this war between the Shia and the Sunnis. The Shia are backed by Iran. The Sunnis are backed by Saudi Arabia. There's this proxy war going on between Sunnis and Shias, and then you got the Kurds, and you got the Yazidis, you got all these other groups. And George Bush says, well, I thought they were all Muslim, not knowing that these are this is the sectarian violence that goes on between Muslim groups. So he didn't even understand the culture of the people. So how's he going to try to, bring democracy to the Middle East? He doesn't even understand the people that he's dealing with. Okay, Lisa. Okay, what's the next one? I'm not looking at the list you gave me, so just put it. Okay. The next one, Lisa, is piggybacking off the next one is the Iran war. Now, very similar. This ties in because Iraq and Iran, they have a symbiotic relationship. Basically, they went to war a lot in the 80s. So Iran is a unique situation. To give some background about Iran, and this goes all the way back to 1953. Iran was electing a man by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. He was going to nationalize the oil fields in Iran and basically use that revenue from the Iranian oil fields to help the people of Iran. He had some socialist leanings, and he was going to basically kick the British out of dealing with oil in Iran, because when oil was first discovered in Iran, they made a deal with the British. British at this time was a global power, global British hegemony. The sun never set on the British Empire at this particular period of time when they made this. But by 1953, World War II has happened. England is, decreased severely. England is starting to lose its sway in the Middle East. Iraq becoming independent, Israel, Palestine becoming independent, Jordan becoming independent, Egypt finally throwing off the shackles of British rule. All their territories, all their holdings, in the Middle East start to diminish, as well as their holdings in other places like India, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, all these other places. Britain's empire that was big was shrinking, but they still had this holdout with the government in Iran to deal exclusively with their oil. But if this guy comes to power, being a socialist, and he wants to nationalize Iranian oil, that will threaten the British, right? That will threaten their last little bit of influence within the Middle East. Now, what they start to tell the Americans is that this guy is a socialist, right? This guy is a Marxist. This guy, if he's allowed to take power in Iran, he will be allies with the Soviet Union. And we're in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We figure, hey, we cannot afford another China. We cannot afford another Cuba. We cannot afford another country. And being as they are so geographically close, Iran is to Russia, imagine if they were to fall to communism and socialism too. So the United States then institutes a secret coup led by Teddy Roosevelt's great-great-grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, this democratically elected leader of Iran, and put somebody in power in Iran that we favor, that is favorable to the United States and not a socialist, right? Or a Marxist. So we overthrow him. We keep it completely a secret. And some people know it, some people don't. And we put in power the Shah. And the Shah is a friend of the United States. He's a secularist. He's the monarch of Iran, supposedly tracing his origins back to the Qajar dynasty, which was the last dynasty in Iran. So he's our ally. He westernizes the country. He liberalizes the country. He is a friend of Israel. He's a friend of the United States. Iran was like a mini America at one point in time. It was like Cuba. Cuba was a mini Las Vegas. The mob was controlling it, but the people were being taken advantage of because they suffered because of this allegiance to the United States. So it was similar with Iran. From the outside, it looked good for Iran. They were secular. They were working with the states, working with Israel, whatever. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, he was, all good, right? But the people rise up. They don't like the Shah's dictatorship, and they associate the Shah with the United States because the regime are friendly, and because the United States put him in power in 1953. They elected somebody, and the United States took that somebody out and put somebody else in power that they liked. Right? And then, of course, that makes the Iranians mad. So in 1979, there is an Iranian revolution, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was once a secular country, once a very liberal country under the Shah, becomes the first Islamic republic, the first country to impose Sharia law officially in modern times. Not unlike Afghanistan with the Taliban, but this happened earlier, right? And they hold the Americans hostage in the embassy for months and months. It's a very notorious thing. And the president at the time, 1979, the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, goes in to try to rescue these hostages in the American embassy in Iran, and he fails. And because of this, he is so unpopular that almost every state is red for Ronald Reagan. Even the very liberal states like New York and California turn over to Reagan. He loses tremendously, like in a fucking landslide. Reagan wins his first election in 1980. But unbeknownst to the Democrats, Reagan's campaign people, make a deal with the Iranians. And they tell the Iranians, listen, don't let go of the hostages until I get elected, so I could look like I was the one. Ronald Reagan and people are saying this. I could look like I was the one who brought the hostages home. So it makes me and the Republican Party look bad, and it makes Carter and the Democrats look weak. So that's what they do. And no sooner than Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, they bring the hostages home. And from that point on, we cut off all ties with Iran. Iran was once one of our closest allies in the Middle East, is no longer that. Our relationship is cut off. Now, and because of that, we then sponsor other countries that are next to Iran to go against Iran. We sponsor Saddam. We give Saddam the weapons, because Saddam is a secularist and Saddam is a Sunni Muslim, to go against the Shia Muslim dictatorship of Iran throughout the 1980s. So Iran and Iraq are going to war in the 1980s, killing each other, and we're sponsoring Saddam, and we're sponsoring, arming Saddam to fight the Iranians, because we consider the Iranians to be our enemy. But like bin Laden, Saddam then turns on the United States, right? And we start to go to war with him, as we talked about before. Now, there was a secret deal in the 1980s, because once again, Iran is sending, Shia militias throughout the Middle East to terrorize other people. And Hezbollah starts up as a result of the Lebanese civil war. There's a civil war in Lebanon, because again, Lebanon is much like Iraq and other countries. It is a country that's divided by several different religious groups. You have the Maronite Christians on the one hand, you have the Shia Muslims, you have the Druze, you have the Sunni Muslims, and the Shia Muslims, right, get the patronage of Iran. So Iran starts up a Shia militia group in 1982 by the name of Hezbollah to protect Shia Muslims from Israelis, to protect Shia Muslims from Sunnis and from the Maronite Christians. So, we try to help in 1982. We try to help the Christian resistance fighters against and the Israelis to stop terrorism in Lebanon. So we invade Lebanon in 1982, but it's a disaster, and Reagan immediately pulls out of Lebanon. His intervention in the Lebanese civil war. But during that time, Hezbollah captures some hostages, and Hezbollah's official representative is Iran. But remember, we're not supposed to be dealing with Iran. Iran is under an embargo. But President Reagan secretly, once again, goes behind and starts to and gives weapons to the Iranians. Even though we're not supposed to, he gives weapons to the Iranians in exchange for those hostages. And he trades weapons with us. So we're in a weapons deal with the Iranians, even though we're not supposed to. And we use those weapons to fight against the communists in Nicaragua. And this is what's called the Iran-Contra scandal that happened in 1986, where President Reagan basically lost the plot and basically, went against his own embargo. So even though we're not supposed to be dealing with Iran, we actually did deal business with Iran. Now, fast forward to 2026. what ends up happening. Hezbollah has power in Lebanon. Iran is patronizing them, giving them money. They're also giving Assad money in Syria. All the Shia groups, Iran, subsidizes, and some Sunni groups like Hamas. But what ends up happening is October 7th. October 7th, 2000. Yeah, that too, Lisa. Trump is easily led. October 7th, 2023. We know what happened. It's the day that will live in infamy. It was the attack at the Nova Music Festival led by Hamas. Now, it was supposed to be Hamas and Hezbollah working together. Hezbollah in the north, invading Israel from the north in the Golan Heights in Syria, and Hamas from Gaza in the south. That doesn't end up happening. They're out of sync. Hezbollah doesn't get involved, but Hamas does. Now, all throughout this time, the Israelis they're fighting a war on two fronts. They're fighting Hezbollah, who gets involved eventually, and they're fighting, which is an Iranian proxy, and they're fighting Hamas, which is also being funded by Iran, even though Hamas is Sunni, right? Because Palestinian Muslims are majority Sunni. There's no really Shia faction within within the Palestinians. The Druze, but they're like us, they're in the north of between Syria and Israel, but they are a separate religious group. They're not even considered as Muslims, right? Some don't even consider them as ethnically Arab. But Hamas is Sunni, but still they're fighting against Israel. One thing Sunnis and Shias have in common, and all Middle Easterners, all people from the Muslim world, they hate Israel. Like, they might be secularists like Saddam, they might be Shias, they might be Sunnis, but every single Muslim, there's not a Muslim on this earth that supports the Zionists. When it comes to the Zionists, when it comes to the state of Israel, all Muslims consider that as something to rally behind. So even though Iran is Shia, they're giving support to Hamas, and they planned the attacks. The Iranians planned this attack on October 7th because Hamas is not really that powerful enough. Hezbollah is not that powerful enough. Iran is behind it. You know what I mean? So Israel goes to war in Lebanon, and Biden is not really helping out. In fact, when the war first starts in 2023, Biden blocks weapon sales to Israel, right? Because Israel's response to what happened on October 7th was to go completely into Gaza and massacre everybody, right? With zero regard for human life, and just starve the Palestinians out. And Biden knew that if he helps Israel out, that it would cost him the election. And it was an election year coming up in 2024. So he doesn't do that, right? He basically tries to play both sides. He tries to appeal to the Democrats who don't want another forever war. We just got out of Afghanistan. And he tries to appeal to some Republicans, especially the neocons, that they want another war. The neocons, going back to 2008, going back even further, to way back to 1979, they wanted regime change in Iran. They wanted to see the Islamic Republic of Iran be destroyed, the IRGC. Right? This is what they wanted. This is what Lindsey Graham and John McCain and all these neocons were thinking. We got Iraq, we got Saddam out of power. The next step is Iran. And Trump gets in 2016, and they try to influence him to do it. And he doesn't, right? He does attack Qasem Soleimani. and kills Qasem Soleimani in 2019, but that's about it. But his second term, October 7th, has happened, so it's different. Everything is different now. Now we have a bigger reason because of October 7th. So they waved the banner of October 7th. Remember, we talked about in other wars where when something happens, like Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack, the massacre, that becomes the pretext to World War II, for us to enter into World War II. The massacre at the Alamo during the Mexican-American War, that becomes the pretext for us to enter into the Mexican-American War. So, and as soon as September the 11th, 2001, a reason to invade Iraq, a reason to invade Afghanistan. So October 7th becomes the new 9/11. October 7th, we had to do it because of October 7th. As soon as you object to this police action in Iran, you're like, well, what about October 7th? So after that happens, Israel goes on a tear. They defeat Yahya Sinwar, they defeat Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, they defeat everybody. And for 12 days in 2025, Iran and Israel went to war, what is called the 12 Days War. And it came to a stalemate. But the United States finally did intervene on Israel's behalf, destroying 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. But that hasn't stopped the Iranians. After that, Israel devised a plan. This is how they destroyed Hezbollah. They devised a plan where they synchronized beepers. And when these beepers beeped, they would explode, and all the people from Hezbollah would be destroyed, right? So it seemed like they didn't need our help. But another thing that's happening in Iran too is there is an uprising in Iran, similar to the Arab Spring in 2011. There is an uprising in Iran where people want to get rid of the Islamic Republic. The Green Revolution happened in 2009. We thought, okay, finally it's going to happen. Iran's going to go back to being a democratic nation again. They're going to overthrow the Islamic Republic. That doesn't happen because the United States doesn't support that. But this, with social media, we're seeing Iranians, especially Iranians from the United States. The Iranian American community is very anti the mullahs, anti the Islamic Republic, anti the IRGC, and they want the son of their deposed king that was thrown out in 1979 to be put back on the throne. The guy, he looks like Squidward. Okay, Lisa and I joked about him looking like Squidward. He's Pahlavi. He's of the Pahlavi dynasty. That's his family name. He was a child when the Islamic Republic came into being. He's never been king. He's never been in the government. But with this invasion of Iran, led by the United States and Israel, they finally decide, both the United States and Israel decide, what we have to do? Invade Iran. For no reason at all. Iran didn't attack us, but we have to liberate the people of Iran from the Islamic regime. So now you're seeing hashtags going around, I'm not Muslim, I'm Persian, because they want to go back to the way things were before 1979. Iranians' relationship with Islam is very weird because how does Islam get to Iran? Iran is not an Arabic country. They speak Persian. Their civilization is older than the Muslim civilization, right? You have the Battle of Thermopylae, like the movie 300. These were Persians going against the Greeks. right? You have Persians in the Book of Esther, right? The king Ahasuerus in Persia. These were Persians, right? So they're proud of their Persian heritage and they want to go back to being secular Persians and with this king. They don't want to be um, Islamist. Some of them don't even want to be Muslim anymore. Forget about political Islam. They don't even want the religion anymore. They're kind of tired of it. So Trump is using that as a pretext to invade Iran. Not like Lisa said, he's easily led because this is to Netanyahu's advantage. If Netanyahu can help the monarchists get back into power and help the old government of Iran get back into power, then Israel has a new ally in the Middle East. And that would deter Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, in 2015, Barack Obama opened up, just like he did with Cuba, he opened up communications with Iran with the hopes that by opening up communications with Iran, we could monitor them from getting a nuclear weapon. They wouldn't be able to get a nuclear weapon, and that would, of course, protect the entire Middle East. And that was called the JCPOA, or otherwise known as the Iran deal. And it was basically a way, okay, we have the lines of communication open with Iran so we can monitor Iran. What does Trump do? He comes in office in 2016, he gets rid of the Iran deal. He says the Iran deal is a disaster. So then what that does is now Iran is able to do all these terrorist attacks without us knowing because we don't have relations with her anymore. So that actually makes shit worse. So one of the reasons why she was able to pull off Iran was October 7th is because we cut relations with them and we weren't able to monitor them. So October 7th never would have happened if Trump had listened to Obama and stood in good relations with the Iranians, so at least we can monitor them. But no, that didn't happen. Now Trump wants to institute regime change. He figures, hey, we did it in Venezuela. It was successful in Venezuela, and this is Operation Epic Fury, right? It was successful in Venezuela, so it'll be successful in Iran, overthrowing them and putting, not Pat Levy, not the Squidward guy, because here's what it is. All the monarchists online that want the king to come back, they want the king's son to be on the throne. They're thinking, and he's thinking, yeah, as soon as we overthrow the IRGC, I'll be back in power. I'll be the king again. Trump tells him, no, I don't think, you don't have the capability to be in power, which he doesn't. He's never governed anything. He was a king in exile. What this guy is, he looks like Squidward, Lisa, but his story resembles that of Mufasa. Simba. He's basically Simba. He was never king, but he was how Simba was kicked out of Pride Rock and he was living in exile and Scar was taking over. Scar is the IRGC. Scar is the current regime in Iran, and he is Simba. He's looking to have Trump and Israel overthrow the IRGC and he be back in power in Iran, but he's never governed. He's never been king. So how do we know he knows what to do? Right? He's a king in exile. So even Trump said, we killed Ali Khamenei, he's like, well, we'll get somebody else, somebody with more experience. But the problem is that somebody with more experience is going to be somebody from the IRGC. Because they've been governing the country since 1979. So Ali Khamenei loses. Dies and is thrown out of power, and who do they put in place of him? His son, Mujtaba Khomeini. You know what I mean? So Pahlavi didn't get in power either. But this war is I think the United States has bitten off more than it can chew when it comes to this, because Iran is one of those nations. Iran is a lot like Afghanistan, where it's never been defeated. Iran, in its history, has been defeated and conquered 3 times, and only 3 times. In 332 BC by Alexander the Great and the Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks. Um, by the Muslims in the 7th century, led by Khalid ibn Walid, and that's when the Muslims come into Iran and they turn Iran Muslim, right? And then again in the 13th century by the Mongols, and they take over and they found the Ilkhanid dynasty in Iran in the 13th century. Other than that, Iran has won every conflict that it's ever faced. Iran is a formidable opponent. And I think both Trump and Netanyahu underestimated Iran. Iran is not like Afghanistan. Iran is worse than Afghanistan, because Afghanistan and Iraq, they were bifurcated with different people of different ethnicities. With Iran, it's like 90% Persian, 90% Persian ethnically, and Shia Muslim religiously. There's more unity. There are ethnic minorities in Iran, like there are in other countries. In fact, the president of Iran, which is like the president of Iran is like our vice president, right? A secondary position behind the Ayatollah. The president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, he is of the Azeri ethnicity. He is a minority in Iran. He's not Persian. He's Azeri. So there are minorities in Iran. There's even Arabic people in Iran, but most of the people there are Persian and like 90% Shia Muslim. So there's more unity with them than in Afghanistan or Iraq. So I think that's why the United States will lose this conflict. But yes, Lisa is absolutely right. Trump was led by Netanyahu to think that Iran is a threat to the United States, which Iran doesn't like the United States, let's be real. In their Congress, at the end of it, they chant death to America, death to Israel. So they hate both the United States and Israel. And Hezbollah still exists. This is why the Israelis invaded Lebanon what, two or 3 days ago. So they're basically fighting the war on 2 fronts. They're fighting in Iran as well as fighting in Lebanon to try and quell the militancy there. What I would like to see happen is I would like to see the United States, win and Iran return back to the way Iran was. And they don't even want a democratic country. They want a monarchy. They want their king back. These monarchists like PBD, the, the podcaster Valuetainment, conservative podcaster. He wants the regime back. But the question is, we have again, history repeating itself. How does this benefit us? Iran has a lot of oil. Iran is the leading petroleum producer in the world. But other than that, we don't see a benefit for us, right? We see a benefit mainly for Israel, because if the IRGC is defeated and Pahlavi comes back in, I didn't see the question, Lisa. I didn't see the question. I'm looking for the question, Lisa. I didn't see it. Did you put it in my inbox? Okay. I I don't know. I don't know, Lisa, what the question was. Type it in the description box. I still don't see it, Lisa. Oh yeah, okay. Lisa brought something to my attention as well. I forgot to mention another main reason why Trump got involved with Iran was the Epstein files. The Epstein files, Jeffrey Epstein. Really, nobody knows what the hell he did, like what was his job. But according to the emails, he was a Mossad agent. He worked for the Israeli Secret Service, and he had dirt on all these American politicians, including Donald Trump, that he could use, and British politicians like Prince Andrew, that he could use to bribe whatever government to get him to do what he wanted, and basically to have a lot of dirt, even though Epstein killed himself or whatever, whatever happened to him, you know, in 2019, Trump is in the Epstein files for PDF ness, nastiness, and everything. So the Epstein files are being released, and people are, coming out on him, even some of his ardent supporters. So he wants to try to switch the focus from that to this war. And this has been done a lot of times. This was done with Nixon. This is why Nixon expanded the war in Vietnam to Cambodia because of the Watergate scandal. This was done with Bill Clinton. This is one of the reasons why he went into Sudan, other than the attack on the embassies to get bin Laden in 1999. He was to distract from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So it's like, don't look here, look over there. Don't focus on the Epstein files, focus on the war. But now we're in a social media age. And just like radio impacted World War II and television impacted Vietnam, um, in the digital age, in the social media age, Iran is pushing back in the propaganda war. They produced a Lego movie about Donald Trump and Netanyahu and him being in the Epstein files. They basically came out with a diss track against the United States and Israel during this war. Iran is winning the propaganda war. People don't want another forever war. They don't want another Iraq. They don't want another Afghanistan. They are like, what the fuck? We don't want to be there. We don't care. We do care in a sense that Iran is not a free country, and we wish the Iranians well. We wish that the Iranians would have regime change, but there's nothing we can do because we go in there and we try to change the regime. We change the regime, but then we'll never leave, and that'll antagonize the people even more. And then by the time we leave, what will end up happening? The IRGC or some form of it will return back. That's what happened in Syria. That's what happened in Libya. That's what happened in Iraq, and it happened in Afghanistan. So, right, more than one Lego movie. A lot of Lego movies. I mean, and they also like have pictures of rappers, pictures of American, dissident political figures like Malcolm X. They have a missile with Tupac's picture on it. They're trying to appeal to the minorities in America because one of the things that is very unique about the IRGC is that when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979 and they took those hostages, they stormed the embassy. They let all the black people that were working in the embassy go, and they only kept the white people. So they basically are saying, look, we know that black people have had it hard in the United States, and our cause sympathizes with the black people in the United States. We're not blaming you, we're only blaming the white Americans. So they use these black American political figures and social figures and pop culture figures like Nipsey Hussle, like Tupac, like Malcolm X, as like propaganda tools to say, look, we're on the side of revolution, we're on the side of the African Americans. We're cool with black people. We're not cool with the white Americans because they're imperialist and they're racist and they're MAGA and stuff. So, they were the first country to put out a Malcolm X stamp years before the United States even did it. Iran did it first. So Iran doesn't have a problem with black people per se and minorities. Like one of their propaganda videos was appealing to Native Americans and Black Americans. Like, look, your country has mistreated you, and countries always do that. That's what we did in Afghanistan with Russia. When we did with Russia and the Soviet Union, we appealed to minorities. We appealed to the refusnik Jews that were trapped behind the Iron Curtain in the 60s and 70s. We appealed to the Muslims. They appealed to ethnic groups, the minority ethnic groups, the groups that are being oppressed by that particular regime to get those people as their allies. So Iran is doing that as well. And Iran is winning the propaganda war. People don't, like Lisa said, people don't actually care about the goings on of Iran. Like I said, some people they wish the Iranians well. They wish the Iranians would overthrow the IRGC. It's sad what's happening. The IRGC is cracking down on all these protesters and killing them, and really nobody is saying anything. But at the same time, we're tired of fighting Israel's wars. We're tired of Israel dictating to us who we should be fighting, because we're not going to fight forever. We're not going to fight your wars forever. We're not fighting another war for you. Lisa's saying they're winning the war altogether, especially with the Straits of Hormuz. Yeah, they closed the Straits of Hormuz to American and Israeli ships. They are winning. The Americans, Netanyahu and Trump, are lying to the people that we're winning. We're not winning, we're losing. I just hope that better heads prevail. A couple of days ago, Trump released a tweet saying that he will blow Iran back to the Stone Age. Of course, he tacoed. Trump always chickens out, and he didn't actually do that. But I believe this will be a stalemate situation. And the situation in Gaza is part of it, and that cost Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Joe Biden dropped out of the race again because it was similar to LBJ in Vietnam. Biden lifted the lockdown and embargo on the sale of weapons to Israel, and he began to give Israel weapons, which they used to fight Hezbollah and commit the genocide in Gaza. And neither Kamala Harris nor Joe Biden, denounced the Israelis for the genocide they were committing in Gaza, and that eventually cost Kamala Harris. But just like with Nixon, history repeated itself. People didn't like LBJ because they said he escalated in Vietnam, so he drops out of the race in 1968. His vice president Hubert Humphreys runs in his place, but Hubert Humphreys doesn't say that he's going to pull out of the war in Vietnam. So the war in Vietnam cost the Democrats, just like this. And we thought it was going to be all good when Nixon got in office and he was going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. He escalates even further. So Trump does the same thing. He campaigns as a peace president. He says, "Remember my last presidency from 2021 to from 2017 to 2021. I didn't start any new wars. He didn't pull out of Syria. He didn't pull out of Afghanistan, but he didn't start any new wars." Right, so he campaigns as a peace president in 2024. And now look, we're just like with Nixon, history repeated itself. We were fooled again because he came in as a peace president, but he pushed the war even further. So now it's not just Gaza, now it's not just Lebanon, now it's Iran. Like now you're going directly to the source and you're invading Iran. It's kind of like when the Soviet Union was funding their proxies. During the 6-Day War, the Soviet Union formed 1967. The Soviet Union formed an alliance with Egypt, and they started funding Egypt to go against the Israelis in Egypt and Syria to go against the Israelis in 67. Imagine if when that happened, instead of just helping out Israel and just giving them weapons like LBJ did, imagine we would have actually invaded Egypt to overthrow their president, who was the main sponsor of the retaliation against Israel, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And we tried to do regime change in Egypt in 1967. That's what this is like. So we're not just going against the groups that Iran is sponsoring, we're going against actually Iran, trying to do regime change in Iran for Israel's benefit, because the more regimes that are less militantly Islamic, the more Israel has a chance to be Lisa saying yes, and I believe that too. The midterms are coming up this year, and the Republicans have done a very poor job at governing. They control the three main branches of government. They control the Senate, they control the House of Representatives, the presidency, and Congress. They have a majority in Congress, they have the presidency, and they have a majority in the Supreme Court. So they basically have all kinds of rule, and they're fucking up epically. So epic fury is going to be epic fail for Donald Trump come the midterms this year, because even his most ardent followers are against this. What this Iran war is doing, this combined with the genocide in Gaza, what this is doing is not only causing a backlash for Republicans and a backlash for MAGA. MAGA has basically broken up. MAGA is now two factions. MAGA is the America First faction with Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and everybody that was kicked out of the initial MAGA, coalition. And the people that were against MAGA at first in 2016, like the Ben Shapiro's, the Mark Levins, all the neocons, they were against MAGA because Trump was running as a peace president, saying he wasn't going to get involved in any wars in the Middle East. So they're against that. They want wars in the Middle East. So, it protects Israel. So what this is doing is causing not only a rejection of MAGA, not only a rejection of the Republican Party, it's causing anti-Semitism. Israel's actions in Gaza, Israel's actions in Lebanon, and in the Iran epic fury invasion is causing anti-Semitism, because what people are saying is, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Who's this benefiting? Benefiting the state of Israel, benefiting Jewish people, right? So, and we've seen this before. We've seen this kind of reaction before. During World War II, there were people, they were called the silver shirts. Hitler had the brown shirts, Mussolini had the black. Hitler had the brown shirts in Germany. Mussolini had the black shirts in Italy, and they were basically street gangs that were politically patronized by these political groups in these countries, and they subscribed to fascist ideology. Well, in America, we had something similar. We had the silver shirts, and these silver shirts were against going to war in World War II because they liked Hitler. And then, and Charles Lindbergh, this is where America First comes from. Charles Lindbergh coined the phrase America First because they were isolationists. They didn't want to go to war in World War II, and they blamed the Jewish people, right? That because it was seen as a war to benefit the Jewish people. Obviously, Hitler was antagonistic, hateful, anti-Semitic to the Jewish people. So if we're going to war and we're trying to help them, but people that don't want to go to war, like, well, fuck these people. Why are we going to war for them? Similarly, before that, in the 1860s, there was a draft. The Civil War was the first war ever where a draft was instituted. So New York is part of the Union, and a lot of people that they're sending over to draft them into the army are newly European immigrants that are coming over from places like Ireland, especially Ireland, places like Poland. So the Civil War is starting, and it's very unpopular. People don't want to be drafted in. So they start to say, who's the cause of this? You know why we're going to war why we're doing this Civil War shit? We don't benefit in any way from it. Black people benefit. So black people there's a riot in 1863 in New York called the 1863 Draft Riot in New York, in which citizens, newly arrived immigrants from Ireland, stormed the black orphanage, and they burned the orphanage down because it causes a lot of racism, because they're like, we don't want to go to war, so who we're blaming? The person that we're supposedly fighting the war for, and that is black people. Same thing in World War II, and now this is happening again. It's like people are turning against Jewish people because they're like, we don't want to fight any wars for you. Why are we fighting this war for you? Why are we fighting for you, to benefit you? Like, and then it doesn't make it any better that Epstein's Jewish, right? That Epstein had in the files, Epstein was talking down to non-Jewish people, saying that Goyim will be the slaves of the Jewish people, that Goyim lived to serve the Jewish people. So, this is causing a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, this conflict with Iran. As soon as you discuss even Holocaust Remembrance Day, you discuss this kind of stuff, people people start coming out with their anti-Semitism. That's what we saw. The rise of Nick Fuentes is very anti-Semitic. Kansas has anti-Semitic. So that's where this is sadly ending up. If the United States had never gotten involved in Iran, I don't think you know, this will be an issue. The Israelis, for them, this is a crusade for them because October 7th, you know, is big. But for us, October 7th didn't really affect us. You know, that has no effect on us. Saying, well, what about October 7th to us here in the United States? It means nothing to. Yes, there were American hostages among the hostages that Hamas had. So, but the vast majority of Americans weren't affected by it at all. So, that's it, guys. That's the last war on the list. The United States has been in existence, well, will be in existence um, for 250 years this year. This is the 250th year. Birthday of the United States this July 4th coming. And we have been at war for 230 of those years of the United States existence. We have been at war with one party or another. So just let that sink in. In our whole history, we've had 20 years of peace. And that was in the 80s and 90s. Other than that, our entire history is war with one group or another. That's why people love the 90s. Oh, we will be. We will be definitely so because this issue in the Middle East is not going away. We pull out of Iran, so what? People are still, listen, people in the Middle East are never, well, maybe they'll come around to it eventually. You know, say Israel's there for 100 years. You know, they're going to finally say, you know what, enough trying to fight it. It is what it is. Israel's going to stay there and Israel will remain there. Israel's been there for 75 years. And people in the Middle East are never going to really accept Israel. You know, unilaterally. They're never going to accept Israel. You know what I mean? And as long as they don't accept Israel and they don't make peace with Israel, we, as Israel's friend, will always back up Israel. Now, the only thing that will change, if that ever changes, is if AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, has less control in the government. And if there's a law passed that AIPAC cannot interfere with our government to try to buy off our politicians, unless that happens, wars in the Middle East will continue indefinitely, Lisa, because if it's not Egypt, if it's not Syria, if it's not Jordan, if it's not Iran, if it's not Al-Qaeda, if it's not Saddam, every regime in the Middle East since 1948 has opposed the state of Israel. They call it the Nakba. When Israel declared its independence May 14th, 1948, and they drove a lot of the Palestinians out because they wanted to create a Jewish majority state. They call it, in Arabic, it means the Nakba. What does the Nakba mean? The catastrophe, the disaster. It's a slap in the face to people in the Middle East, Muslims in the Middle East, that Israel even exists. And the fact that we back up Israel makes us just as culpable to the rest of the world. Now, that relationship, we call them our greatest ally. Now, I always think that's a kind of it's a one-sided friendship, because Israel didn't go to Iraq, Israel didn't go to Afghanistan. Oh, the United States has existed for 250 years, and out of that 250 years, we've been at war with various different groups and uh, parties for 230 years of that. That's it. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Thank you guys for watching. Peace. Who knows what other wars are going to be on the horizon? China, Russia, who knows?